Talk. One of you.
You can tell what this means to me.
The story itself was not much to my liking, but I think it showed an uncanny understanding of what most people like.
You have nothing to say to me? Nothing to ask me?
I recognized your voice.
Use your noodle. You're making this so complicated.
Am I wrong?
How are you supposed to keep all that straight? You lost. I have a life, and it only goes in one direction. Forward.
Welcome to Mad Men Men, the weekly show where we discuss a show that used to come out weekly. Now, we are recapping the first season of Mad Men, and we're going to be talking about the rest of Mad Men as well. But I want to get something out of the way. You know, It's just going to be two of us for this one.
Sure.
And I hope everyone's okay with that. I'm trying to be. If this is your first time listening for some reason, and you haven't listened before and have an idea what we're doing here, I am a big Mad Men fan. My name is Jon Negroni. I'm a film critic, and I love Mad Men. It's probably my favorite TV show of all time. I've rewatched it many times. But my other host here, Will Ashton from Collider, he never really watched past the first season.
Yeah, it was a while ago. Yeah. I watched it shortly around the time it aired. I remember I got the DVDs for it, and I, for some reason, fell behind and never got around to watching the rest of it. So it's basically like I'm watching a season for the first time again. I kind of remember some things. Actually, this episode, as I was watching it, I felt like I was remembering things as they're happening pretty well. But you know, the season, it's basically I'm watching it fresh, and then the other seasons I'll be watching them completely fresh. So yeah. There you go. Yeah,
I'm excited about that. We're going to get through the first season. I think it's going to be a fun time. We're almost halfway through, and I think we're getting to the point where the show is starting to find its kind of identity, I guess, which is fitting considering it's a show about identity in many ways. And I've talked about this. I came into the show around season 4. So I was a little bit later. I came into it while I was in college and I was studying advertising. And I obviously have been hooked on it ever since. And I always love an excuse to talk Mad Men. We're going to kind of break down this episode and take a look at what's going on here in the writing and what we think about it at this point. And we, of course, want to guide you all along here. And I wanted to get something clear, too, so people understand.
Sure.
If you are a first-time watcher of Mad Men, which similar to Will in some cases, like semi-first time,
sure,
we are not going to be talking about nothing that happens past this episode of the show, right? So we're not going to be spoiling anything, so you can first-time watch it with us.
I mean, I'm not going to say anything, I don't think.
I'm not. Yeah,
I don't know if I can.
Well, there's some things
A few things.
You've been spoiled on, which is unfortunate.
Not by choice. I mean, more by cultural, oasis, I guess, just kind of being present around the time the show was on the air. I heard some things, I saw some things, and then I learned about some things some other ways. So, mostly indirectly, sometimes not, but,
That's right. And if you come across Will on social media, be nice. Don't spoil him. That would be very, very mean.
That wouldn't be cool. I wouldn't be a fan of that.
So we're going to give kind of a step-by-step recap of the episode, and then we'll talk about what we think overall. The first thing to get out about this episode is that of the first season, it's a little less subtle in some ways than some of the other episodes. It's pretty on the nose, actually, for better and for worse. There are lots of B and C stories. We get something with Ken Cosgrove, like his first real B story of the show. We get a lot of Pete in this episode. We get a little bit of Paul, a little bit of Peggy and Betty. But really, Peggy and Betty's entire storyline really revolves around Dawn's here. And this is definitely a big Dawn episode because this marks the first time we get really detailed information about Dawn's real identity and his past, and really what defines him in the show moving forward as somebody who, what his real motivation is for what he's up to. So the episode starts with Betty and Dawn. They just got home after an award ceremony. So Dawn has won an award called the Nuki. And I told myself I was going to look this up. I know it's an advertising age thing, but I really had never really heard of it beyond this show.
Okay,
I'm sure it's a thing.
You haven't won one of these in your
I have not one of
professional
these.
life. Okay.
One of these. No.
Not
There are
prestigious
other
enough to have.
Well, there
received
are other
this final
awards
award.
that get brought up in the show from time to time that I have heard of. This is just
Okay.
not one of them. But yeah.
Are you not to put you on the spot, but have you won some awards for your work in advertisement?
Yeah, but not me personally.
Okay,
It's
just your
always
team.
been something I've been part of more. That's the thing. The stuff that I do is not like how it is in the show, where you
Sure.
have like the creative director takes all the credit for something.
Yeah.
It's very,
Well,
very different.
I mean, that's kind of
Ryan.
the funny thing about Don in this episode is that it seems like he actually won some stuff personally, but he tries to discredit it. He says like it's more about like the team or like my boss won this award or what have you.
Right.
He doesn't really want to, be the recipient of an award himself. He feels like, I don't know. I'm curious why you think that is for your analysis.
Pete brings it up too at one point. Pete is like, "Oh, that accounts won the award."
Right.
It is a little dicey. I do think there is a reason, but I think it's something that would kind of spoil a character relationship, then spoil something that happens later in the show that I don't want to get into. Actually,
I was wondering if it had to do with, like you said, about identity, the sense that because Don doesn't truly feel he is this person, like he's putting on a persona, that he doesn't really feel like he earned it because he's not.
No, I don't think
actually
that's
Don.
it. I don't think it's it. I think I have a different read on Don in this episode, honestly. And I have a different read on how Don approaches his advertising life. I do think that is what he wants. He wants recognition and the awards, but he wants it in a different way than I think the other characters do. I don't think he cares about awards as much, but again, that gets into some stuff that I don't want to give away for later in the show.
Okay.
But I could see why that would be like a very valid read if you're like kind of coming at this for the first or second time.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I just think it kind of adds to the general theme of this episode, at least as far as I saw it, which is the idea of like all these characters are having trouble or directly or indirectly are blending their personal and their professional lives. And we see that with this episode, like he has an award that he's bringing home, but like he like doesn't really feel comfortable about it. And, in this first scene, he's like kind of drunk off of drunk off alcohol, but also kind of like drunk off the lifestyle and all this stuff. And it is throughout, for reasons we'll discuss later, there is like this blending of like, his characters' personal lives are interfering with their work lives and vice versa. And there's a lot of boundaries that get kind of pushed and pulled in different ways and stuff. And
I mean, not to get into it already, but I think what this episode is getting at is that of all of the characters, Don is one of the few characters here who wants to be defined as the creative director, the award-winning creative director that he is trying to redefine himself as. Whereas everybody else in Sterling Cooper, as we'll talk about, they want to change. They want to be redefined as somebody else. Pete doesn't want to just be the accounts guy. He wants to be Don Draper. Like we see that in the first episode. We see that Pete also wants to have like a novel. Paul Kinsey wants to have a novel. Like these guys want to have a separation between, and they want to brag about their achievements. They don't want the private, sort of secret life thing. They want everybody to know how great they are.
Yeah.
And that is like the defining difference between them and Don. Like that's not what Don's after, and the show is investigating that. So as you're alluding to, they wake up hungover.
Mm-hmm.
And again, very on the nose. Sally kind of like bursts in. It's like, what's that? And then it's an award. Blah blah blah. Roger also won the award. And then it the horseshoe kind of just like falls. And it all speaks to the facade of its very 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 good stuff. This was by the way written by Matthew Weiner and directed by Leslie Glatter. So. Now, when Don gets to the office, he comes a little late, obviously, and he's, welcomed by a bunch of people who are congratulating him. Allison, the receptionist, even says, like, hey, Advertising Age ran a picture, and his picture's in the newspaper. And Peggy, his secretary, Peggy Olson, tells him that, they were waiting for him, Pete and Paul, but Don was so late that they kind of left. And, Don kind of jokes around, calls him rude. And then he goes into the office and he sees that Ken is around. And Ken actually wrote a short story. And this is like one of the inciting incidents of the story. That kind of the B story is that Ken Cosgrove, who is an account guy, just like Pete, he wrote a short story for The Atlantic. And it's kind of taken everybody by surprise. They're like, wait, you did that? You know, they can't believe it. It's called Tapping a Maple on a Cold Vermont Morning. I was curious what you thought of that title. Very Atlantic monthly.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, I mean, that was the big thing, right? Is that it's not solely that he wrote, you know, a short story. He got published in the Atlantic, which, I mean, you know, certainly a prestigious publication now. I mean, I imagine it was back then too, maybe even more so than it is now. You know, it's not an easy thing. I've never been published in the Atlantic. I don't think you have either. It's no small feat. And we learned that, Ken not only wrote the short story, like he doesn't even consider himself a short story writer. He wants to fancy himself as a novelist. I think he says he's
written 2 novels. Now he hasn't published 2 novels, but he's written them. Yeah.
Yeah. I forget. He detailed one of them and it sounded non-specific. But
yeah, I mean, both of them do relate to the main thrust of this episode, actually, like Dawn's story about family. Like one of them is about a woman being left to farm. The only person who will help her is this boy. And it's extremely like directly calling to like Dawn, you know, and the stuff that happens with him and his family in this. But we'll guess that, I guess. But yeah, I think the thing that strikes Paul and Pete so much, like clearly they're jealous as heck. Sure. And one of the things that makes them jealous is that they can't understand, like they actually like criticize him for not talking about it before he was published, which is so funny because like, of course, like if he had said anything beforehand, it would have come off as bragging. It would have come out as sort of like boasting about something that wasn't even successful yet. So he was biding his time until he actually had something to speak of, you know, in regards to this accomplishment. And they, of course, will find any reason to try to like, you know, bring him down a peg, which they can't. Bring him down to Peggy Olson.
Sure. I was going to ask you, I mean, you not only work in advertisement, but you are a writer and published author yourself. Do you find yourself relating to Ken Cosgrove or Pete and what's the other guy's name?
Paul.
Paul. Do you find yourself relating more to Pete or Paul in your workplace?
I'm not going to lie to you, Will. This really hits home. It does rub people off the wrong way, you know? I think a lot of people in advertising, a lot of people in copywriting look at something like a novel as way more difficult of a thing to pull off. And you chase at advertising stuff and copywriting. And like, there are these small achievements like winning an award that seem really cool in the moment. But then when you look at like, oh, but this person wrote a novel, and that's always going to, I think, be more prestigious. It's always going to be more like, you know, the mark of a successful writer than anything having to do with advertising. That's just how it will always be, right? Because it's
if art. You say so, yeah.
But I think that's what Matthew Weiner is getting at, right? He's clearly somebody who, as a TV writer, he clearly values, you know, the making of art in that respect as, you know, perceived to be more superior than what the advertising people are doing. And so I'd like that he's doing that. He's being pretty overt about it.
Yeah, and I mean, there is as we probably discussed and other people have discussed, certainly a very literary quality to Mad Men. And maybe there's this idea that, like, you know, Matthew Weiner for several years had to kind of prove himself as a writer, but he had the pilot for Mad Men written for a long time. And that was like his pet project. And maybe there's something feeding into this script as far as, you know, like, this is like my, you know, my true like thing I want to make. But it's like, yeah, well, where's this script for whatever, you know, insert show here? The only one I know that he wrote before this was for The Sopranos. So I don't think that qualifies, but I'm sure he's written for like sitcoms and other things where, you know, maybe the work wasn't quite as fulfilling and he had, you know, other grander, loftier ambitions creatively. So maybe that feeds into this. I don't know.
It's a mysterious thing. It really is. And, you know, the whole idea of or like all those like little passive aggressive moments where even like Roger at one point is ribbing into Ken, you know, kind of like backhanded compliments with him, being like, oh, that's going to keep you working here. Only $100 a month. That's what Don says. And that passive aggressiveness. Yeah. Oh, boy. That. Yeah. Oof.
But I was also going to say that even is it Roger in the boardroom meeting? He's like, oh, it's not really my thing. Like he like says some weirdly like passive aggressive compliment, you know, like a backhand compliment of some sort.
Yeah, some people would like this,
right? Yeah, or something like that. Yeah, it was harsh, and Ken didn't even seem offended by it. He was just like, yeah, you know.
Well, it's kind of similar to when like Pete is sort of like, hey, that's actually a compliment when you know Trudy tells him, you know, that it's too modern, and he takes it a certain way. But we'll get to that, of course.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, they're in this meeting to discuss an account for Liberty Capital Savings. I think that's the same as Liberty Mutual, but it was called that at the time, I want to say. And they're trying to come up with like a new concept because it's not working. The idea of like trying to bring women in to visit the bank. And so Dawn comes up with an idea that that they should have an executive account, so a private account solely for businessmen. Paul Kinsey at one point is just like, statements come to the office. It's like very, very Mad Men, that entire thing.
Yeah. And, the idea, like, kind of merging, as we discussed before, the private with the business,
Mm-hmm.
Their business thing is like trying to find a way for people to have private expenses and all that,
And it's striking, right, that it's something that Pete and Paul click with immediately, but Ken is you can tell Ken's a little bit like, okay. He doesn't seem to be the same, and I love what they're doing with Ken in this episode, because in that in the first couple of episodes, Ken is just like an immature skirt chaser, honestly. And I know I've read an interview where I think Matthew Weiner was talking about how Ken was supposed to be kind of a really small character at first, but they rewrote him to be more like they kind of kept him in the show because he did so well. And this was one of the first episodes where they really started to bring more material in for him and a backstory, like him being from Vermont and having this sort of like writing, shtick. So I like how this episode sets that stuff out a lot.
My main question is, how does Sal feel about all this? We don't see him at all.
We don't get Sal. He gets a mention at one point. It's like, that's Sal's problem to deal with, the fact that they have to publish this in like a small magazine. But
I wanted to see his wry looks and his, judgmental gaze at any given moment. I feel like I was robbed of that. That was my big complaint. My chief complaint.
Who would live?
This episode.
Yeah, especially in an episode about like your personal life and like keeping secrets.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe it would have been too overt or whatever, but I felt like this episode was lesser. I feel like this episode is lesser by not having some Sal content.
I agree completely. So then we have Peggy. She's trying to intercom into Dawn's office, but she interrupts a phone call that he's having with Midge. Midge has called in for a tryst for him to rush over to her place and for them to have sex. And immediately, like, Peggy is kind of horrified. She didn't mean to listen in, but then she, of course, discovers Dawn's infidelity. Big revelation. She hangs up. Dawn comes out. He says that he has to leave, but he'll be back after lunch. So Peggy knows that he's lying, and this marks a pretty notable shift in the dynamic between Dawn and Peggy, which will come up later. So afterward, we go back to Pete's office, and this is like the part where they're really starting to lay into Ken's short story, and they're thinking like, Ken shouldn't be as successful as he is, because the implication being that he comes from a working class family. And for Pete, that's pretty rich, right? He's a dikeman. He's only in the position he is because of his connections and his name. So to him, it makes no sense that like Ken would be the one who beat them to having something published in The Atlantic. Was
that pun intended that you did there?
I don't. That's rich. That's for you to decide.
Okay, sure. Fair enough.
That's for you to decide. Paul is even more jealous because unlike Pete, he's actually a writer. He's mentioned his novel in the show before. And there's even a funny part where he mentions that he has his own story about like, can you imagine how good my story would be, where he says he gets drunk and ends up in Jersey City with a bunch of African Americans, but he of course does not say African Americans. And he's like, the surprising thing is we all got along. Could you imagine how good that story could be? And Harry's immediate reaction is no.
I mean, you never know. I mean, a similar story won Best Picture only a few years ago with Green Book. So
Green Book.
Yeah.
Exactly. Paul Kinsey. We're not done with him, that's for sure, in this entire show. So then we go to Midge's apartment, and Dawn tells Midge that, hey, like, they've literally just had sex. He waits until after sex to bring this up, and he tells her that she can't call him at work. And I really like this entire exchange they have, where she kind of reflects on, like, she doesn't like how he hurt her feelings by like waiting until, they've had sex for him to make her feel bad about everything. For calling him. And she also has an interesting, exchange with him about how when he comes in to see her, he immediately seems preoccupied, but then he switches gears, she says. And it's like he becomes a different person. And this is our first hint as to what is happening here. Why is Dawn an adulterer? And as this episode kind of lays out, it's because even though he tries so hard to stop being Dick Whitman, his real self, he becomes Dick Whitman in his affairs. It's like he can't resist, like he can't stop himself, because it is part of what keeps him sane. Theoretically, that's kind of what it's implying. What was your read on that, though? I mean, certainly that's where I come at it.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, I mean, that is so core to Don's identity, I feel, in this, at least his first season, is this, like, trying to balance his different personas, trying to, like we said, coalesce that into one Don Draper. But whether it's, balancing the work and home life, or trying to assume the identity of Don, but ultimately still kind of being Dick, it's just something he can never, like, he hides it well, he manages it pretty well, all things considered, but he still can't quite get it all quite right. Yeah,
I mean, it speaks to why it's so jarring for Peggy, because, like you said, he hides it well. It's something that she didn't expect from him because of his previous behavior. He's, defended her from the sort of like boys will be boys mentality of the office. He pushed away her advances and was like clear about there being boundaries. And so for her to see that, actually there's a real Don, there's another layer to this person, is a big moment for her character. So then we go to Pete again. And so Pete is at home with Trudy, and she's reading his short story. This is probably my favorite part of the whole episode. He's clearly still upset about how Ken has found so much success. And, his wife has been reading his short story. And she remarks that, like I said before, she finds it a bit too modern. She's like, I love the classics. And he's a little bit like, oh, that's kind of a compliment. But he's still a little bit like, why doesn't she like it? And she says, I just think it's odd that the bear is talking. I love that line. I love the delivery of the line. And I love Pete's response to it, that he's just like, it's what the bear is imagining, or it's what the hunter is imagining the bear to be thinking. And keep that in mind, Will, because the idea of Pete being obsessed with like a boy hunting is very, very relevant to his character. Okay. I think we've even already seen, have we already seen any moments that have played up on this, or I might be moving too far ahead, actually? I
don't think so. I was going to say, I felt like, and maybe because something more, this is going to contradict what I was going to say, but I felt like the story, like one of the jokes about it was that it didn't feel very personal for him. Like he was just writing for the sake of it. No, it's not honest. Well, that's what I mean. Yeah. So it's like, it feels like I don't know. I mean, I don't know what Ken Cosgrove's story was, his short story was really like, but I imagine it came from some honest place, which is why it got published in the Atlantic. That's why it's literally called Tapping a Maple on a Cold Vermont Morning, which is where he's from. Right. So that's all you need to know, in the sense of like, that is real. That is about his past. And that's why it works. Whereas that's the thing with Pete. Pete is not honest. He's trying to be somebody he's not. He's trying to write a story about a hunter. He's not a hunter. He's not talking to bears. He's not who he purports to be. And it's the opposite thing that Don has. It's the whole point of the episode, because Don's thing, because you'll notice, like, not to skip too far ahead, he, Roger at one point says that, like, you'll find the first 10 pages of a novel and everybody's desk, right? And Don jokes and is like, 5. He's like, oh, he's only written 5. He hasn't written any. Why hasn't? Because we literally see Don open up his drawer in this episode, and there's no novel there. There's something else, but there's no novel. And the reason there's no novel is because to create art, like Matthew Weiner is saying here, you have to accept your past, and you have to understand and apply your past to your art. It doesn't have to be exactly your story, but that's where art comes from. It comes from a place of honesty. And that's why, like, Don would never write a novel. How could he? That's why he is so comfortable in the advertising world. That's why I was pushing back a little bit in the very beginning about the whole, like, him wanting to be in the advertising world. I think that's where he's comfortable, because advertising is all fake. He can sort of spin it in a different way. I was saying that he was uncomfortable with assuming the award, like that the award belonged to him. Not that he was uncomfortable with advertising. I think he's just being fake modest in that respect. Fair enough. That's my take on that. I think we could easily look at a bunch of different perspectives, but I say that for a reason I can't get into. But okay. So Pete then tells Trudy, he's like, well, you know what? You should talk to Charlie Fittich. He works in the big publishing world. Maybe Charlie Fittich could have Pete's story published. But then she's like, Charlie was, she reveals that, like, this is the guy she lost her virginity to. And, she's told Pete the truth about this. Apparently he was really upset about it, but he kind of is telling her, he's like, well, this makes up for that.
So Pete is so horrifically loathsome and ambitious, he will put his wife in that position to get a story published, to, like, I think he says, show Charlie Fittich, like, let's show him what he's been missing. It's pretty deranged.
Yeah.
But I really like, we've seen Pete do some pretty despicable stuff so far. This is definitely one of the highlights, I think, so far in the show.
And it's not even the lowest he gets in this episode.
It's not.
Yeah.
Not even close. Or I guess a little close. Who knows?
I mean, so it's touching the low point for sure of this episode, but not quite there yet.
So the next morning, Don arrives at the office and he's greeted by Peggy, who is still clearly jarred. Like she usually like checks in and greets him, but she doesn't say anything. And I think because what happened the day before is still sticking with her and she's not sure what to make of it. But she does say that the meeting, it's called a traffic meeting, where they're going to be discussing how everything that's going on with accounts has already started in the conference room. And this is the scene we've already alluded to already, where they're, digging a can a bit and, kind of being like, this, I think, so Roger says the story itself wasn't much to my liking, but I think it showed an uncanny understanding of what most people like. And yeah, as you already remarked, it's pretty brutal, pretty harsh. But Ken takes, like you said, he takes it with aplomb, because I think Ken understands. He's like, oh, these idiots are so jealous. And he's fine. He's totally fine. And I think this is the most likable we've seen Ken so far.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. But I mean, like, I don't know. I just feel like I can tell with Paul and Pete, and even to some respect Don, that he can kind of like, yeah, they don't really appreciate this, but they're at least jealous, or they at least like are impressed they did this. I feel like with Roger's compliment, like he doesn't even, it doesn't even faze him. He's just kind of like, care. It's just like, all right,
that fits his character.
Which, I mean, maybe like you said, there is some truth to the idea that like, oh, he doesn't get it because he's like a geezer, and he doesn't really like appreciate what I'm doing. It's too new age for him or whatever or something. Yeah. But yeah.
Well, there's a crucial moment here too, where they're going through their clients and what's going on, and there's a small thing here where Ken kind of says, oh yeah, here's what's going on with I think it was Maytag. And Joan is kind of like, well, have you followed up with them or whatever it is? And he's like, oh yeah, last week, but then I'll do that, And this is a subtle hint that I think the key to Ken Cosgrove and what separates him from his coworkers, particularly Pete, particularly Paul, and even Don, is he has a healthy work-life balance. He, as you can kind of see, he keeps the two worlds separate, but he does it in a way where he prioritizes his personal life, his hobbies, his skills, and things like that, so that he's not dominated by what's going on in the workplace. And it leads to a decent amount of success for the guy. And I think it's an interesting commentary on the different way that he tackles work-life balance compared to his coworkers, particularly Don, who is obsessed and is like such a workaholic. Go back to the office, or say he's going back to the office, and his wife will just believe him because it's Don. And a lot of things thrown around, especially by Betty in this episode, as to how Don is a workaholic.
Yep,
that's that. All right, so Peggy interrupts the meeting. And she comes up to Don, and this is the big moment where she says a man named Adam Whitman is in the reception area waiting for Don. And Don is clearly thrown by this. I forget too. I think they've already mentioned that his name is Dick Whitman, right? Or is this the first time?
Well, no, because there was the meeting with what's his face, that guy on the train.
That's right. Yes. I knew there was one other time. Yeah. Adam Whitman. We get a hint as to who that might be, huh?
Yeah, but yeah, and that in the scene before, it was like on the train, like we said, like even then though, he's kind of like looking over his shoulder, making sure no one is looking out for him. Now he's like throwing off his game. He's at work. He thought this was a safe space for the Don Draper persona. Now there's somebody from his past who knows him, the real him, coming into his place, and he's we're seeing him more protrude than we ever seen Don.
Yeah, Draper. He's sweating.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's like, okay, I've got to deal with this. He leaves and he meets up with Adam, and Adam lights up when he sees Don, and he's a little bit taken by like Don. He thinks Don can't recognize him. He's like, I know I'm grown up, but Dick, it's me, your little brother. So we find out that Adam is his little brother. He tells Don, Freudian slip there. He works as a janitor at the Empire State Building, American Calculator, he says. And apparently he saw Don's picture in Advertising Age, the one that was referenced earlier. And Don kind of is reluctant at first. He's trying to like deny it and be like, I don't know who you are. No. But then Adam knows how to get him to sort of own up to it. And it's like, you can't even look at me. Like he clearly sees through what Don's trying to do. So Don finally gives in and tells him that he can meet him at a nearby diner. The same diner, I think we read in episode 1 or 2, the one where I think it was episode 2.
That was episode 2. Yeah.
It's a diner called Delight. It's been in a lot of movies, actually. It's in Los Angeles. It's not in operation today anymore, but it's actually been in a lot of other shows and movies like Seven and Training Day. Pretty well-known diner.
Cool.
So pretty recognizable, too, for people who are paying very close attention to locations in movies and shows, I guess.
Yeah.
So they, Don goes back to the conference room. He's clearly preoccupied with what just happened. He's going to have to meet Adam in a little bit, and he's very distant. Finally, they end the meeting. Roger has one of his only few fun quips of the episode. Not enough Roger in this episode. That's my main complaint. But he's like, all right, glad everyone can make it sound like they are working so hard. Great Roger line there. Then we go back to the diner. And Don is still trying to deny he's Dick Whitman, and to no avail. Like, it's not working. Clearly not working. He asked Don, he's like, "Why did you do what you did?" And finally, Don acknowledges the truth, and he says, "I couldn't go back there." And he finds out that his mother is dead, but not really his mother. He actually shows a little bit of anger at the mention of her. Like, she wasn't my mother. She never let me forget that. When he tells her she died of stomach cancer, he replies, "Good." Like, it's heavy stuff.
He's making it clear that he is not a fan of that woman in particular, or the uncle who also passed
Uncle
away.
Mac.
Yeah.
So Uncle Mac has passed as well, and so it's just Adam from his past. It's not a lot of detail, and I don't want to say anything else because I want you to experience the show as it is. But
sure.
it certainly is implying that they're all they have left of each other. Adam even mentions at one point that he's like, he knew he saw Don at one point in his uniform when he was just 8 years old. He knew that he wasn't dead, but he didn't know what to do about it. Didn't know how to, deal with it. At one point, he's like, what kind of a name is Donald Draper? Like, it's very funny. My only response to that, though, was like, well, I mean, it's better than Dick Whitman. I mean,
that is true. Yeah.
I'm just saying.
My only real complaint, I mean, maybe you'll disagree with this, but I feel like Adam is maybe a little too guileless. I don't know if that's more performance thing or how it's written or directed, but I feel like he's maybe a little, like, he's perceived a little bit too much of it as an innocent. Like, I feel like, like, especially for someone around his age, like, he'd have a little bit more of a, like, head on his shoulders. Like, he's kind of like so head in the clouds about meeting Don/Dick again. But then again, like, he thought this was like impossible. Like, it's something he's been dreaming about. He mentions that several times. Like, he's like, I only a day ago, I didn't think this was even possible. Now you're here. But
that's why I think it works.
Sure.
Because his reaction is so, like, devastating, because this is what he's always wanted. And, like, you even see it unravel, though. It's like, it starts off from such a place of, like, jubilee, and it devolves into, like, panic, because he's like, he even kind of mentions, he's like, I was like imagining this, and this is it. Like, this is, and he still has that dumb smile on his face, but you can tell the pain behind it. I actually think it's pretty brilliant the way that the actor is doing it here. I forget, the name of the actor. I feel terrible.
Fair enough. I think it's more of a writing thing than his performance. I think his performance is quite good. It also plays into a reoccurring theme of this show, which is expectations versus reality.
Yeah.
You could even say.
Hey, speaking of which, I mean, 500 Days of Summer, I think that movie had the Delight Diner in it as well. So
sure.
Well, combination there.
But I mean, like, the way you, like, want to imagine things and how you want things to be perceived versus how they are in reality, cornerstone of advertisement. Things aren't always as you want them to be portrayed.
Yeah, I mean, Adam mentions, he wants to eat, but, he can't bring himself to because he's just so, like, overcome by everything. And he asked Don, is like, did you miss me at all? And I always am kind of taken by this line. It surprised me a lot the first time when I watched it, but Don says, of course I did. And I think that's when we see the gear switch, the gear switch that Midge was talking about. This is, I think, when he slides into being Dick Whitman, and he's kind of like letting the mirage go away. So he apologizes, but, Adam's like, he tries to say, he's like, he's not mad at Don. He just wants to be part of his life. He tries to find out, like, do you have a wife? Do you have kids? But then that's when Don switches back. He's back to being Don Draper. He says he's leaving. At first he offers to pay for lunch, but then he was like, no, I'm not paying for your lunch because this never happened. This never happened. Keep that line in mind, Will Ashton. And that is an important line of the show.
Harsh.
Tells Adam to forget everything and that he's never going to see or hear from him again. So we'll see if that's true. It's not. Because later in this episode. So we go back to Pete's story. It's hard to kind of go back to Pete's story too, because at this point I'm just like, I care way more about the Don and Adam thing, but okay. She goes over to Charlie Fittish's office. This is what Trudy's doing for lunch. You know what I mean? And, she tries to see if he'll publish Pete's story, but Charlie's sort of like, he even says, he's like, I would have rather had lunch with you, but she's just, instead of like just briefly meeting, but he just wants to hook up with Trudy, and she has a type, Will Ashton. She has such a type because this dude sucks. He's such a jerk. Like, he's literally like, he's like, I want to be with you. I can keep a secret. And she's just like, no, I'm married. I'm a newlywed. What the heck? And then she's even like, maybe you could just think like maybe in old age. She's like, I don't want you when you're old. And I'm like, oh my gosh, get out of there.
I did find it in a sort of very tragic way. I did find it kind of funny that Trudy was still trying to find some sort of compromise. Like, just like, well, maybe in old age, like, like trying to find some sort of like solution to like, she's
trying to compromise with him. Yeah.
Right, well, that's what I'm saying. Like compromise. Yeah. Like she's such like in such a, mess up situation. She's still trying to like kind of act level headed and, kind of like fair minded and all this stuff. And there is kind of a sad sort of funny quality to that little line, I thought. But yeah, this whole scene, this was one of the scenes that, when it was playing out, or like just as soon as I saw the desk, I was like, oh wait, I remember this scene. I remember how it plays out. So it's certainly uncomfortable to rewatch for me. I don't know about you. You've seen this show several times, but it felt even worse for me to watch the second time. Cause it's like, gotta get this icky scene twice. Mm-hmm. But I agree that Trudy is put in a compromised position. She tries her best to act reasonable. Clearly, that's not really a viable situation for this confrontation. So, yeah, it's not a fun time for the two parties involved, or the third party being the audience.
All right, so we go back to Sterling Cooper, and Betty has arrived with Bobby and Sally. They have a scheduled family portrait, but Don has clearly forgotten about it. Peggy didn't even get a chance to remind Don about it because she thinks that Don is out with Midge. That's her assumption, and it's kind of ironic considering, because what he's really doing is actually like arguably worse, possibly. Like, because hiding his entire like identity, his name and everything from Betty, I would argue, you don't have to split hairs, I guess, but like an affair is also horrific. It's terrible. But there are two sides. I guess they're both on like the side of terrible. So that's that. But
well, like you said, we're kind of splitting hairs here. But if you want to look at it from Don's perspective, I feel like he doesn't see himself as Dick. He is like,
he's compartmentalizing
in his mind. He's like, I am Don Draper, and I'm giving myself to you, Betty Draper. Like, that's who I want you to fall in love with. Like, it's not like he's like hiding that identity out of like spite. It's something
I would argue though, when he's with Rachel earlier in the season, I think that's the Don persona. So it's like, I think he does cheat as Dick and he cheats as Don.
Sure. I like I said, splitting hairs, but I feel like when he's cheating, with Midge, he's, just cheating in general, cheating. Yeah, just cheating. Yeah.
What are you doing? It's like going to the break room for the guy. So like I said, Peggy's a little bit frantic because she doesn't know how to, like, she doesn't know, like, should she lie and tell Betty he's somewhere he isn't? She doesn't know what to do about it. So she sends him into Don's office, tries to buy time. She goes over to Joan and is just like, what should I do? And she accidentally alludes to that maybe she does know where Don is. And then Joan dangles out of her Peggy. So she guilt trips Peggy into telling her what Don is up to. And she tells Joan kind of ridiculously that he's basically having an affair. And Joan even says, like, yeah, you should not have told me that. I wouldn't have, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to tell anybody, but you should not have told me that. Speaking to one of the main points of the episode, that there's this expectation that the men of Sterling Cooper, men in general, have their private lives. And
Mhm.
women in their position their job is to keep those lives private. And it is definitely a commentary on the state of affairs in the 1960s. I'll definitely say that.
Yeah, but also like I feel like remind me Christina Hendricks' character's name.
Joan Holloway?
Joan. Yeah, I feel like she like kind of lust over that boundary of like putting the personal in the professional, even to the point where while Peggy's in the office trying to buy time for Dawn, she calls and is like, what's going on? She wants to gossip. She's like the one character who really wants to relish the like boundaries being pushed between the professional and the personal, which is true to her character.
So Peggy takes Joan's advice, decides to just say like she doesn't know where he is, basically just tell the truth, and let Don come up with an excuse and just try to hold them off for the time being. So she gets some candy bars, gives them to the kids. Kids have chocolate all over their faces, and they're hanging out in Don's office. And this is when Betty starts probing Peggy for information, because Betty understands that Peggy, as Don's secretary, probably knows more about his life than she does. And in a way, she has a point. And, she asked Peggy some personal questions too. It's like, oh, do you have a steady? And, that's all that. Joan even calls at one point to check in about the whole thing. Don does eventually arrive, and he's like, oh, yeah, I was at the printer. Don's go-to excuse. He kind of, there's a moment here when Don seems to have some respect for Peggy for covering for him and not basically making the whole thing worse for the guy. He seems to have a little bit of respect for her, ironically, because she has lost a little bit of respect for him in this moment. I thought you were going to say something else, and I was like, all right, lay into it.
No, I mean, I like the shot where she's like in the office, but it's like the camera's pulling back. She's like losing, like you said, like losing that touch. She's kind of drifting away from. Yeah.
Oof, you feel it.
Good stuff.
Very good stuff. Yeah. Okay. So then let's see here. We go right to the home where Betty sees the proofs of the photo shoot. I think they're saying this happened the next day because she already has the photos. She's with Francine. This is the one time we have a Betty moment outside of like her interacting with Don or Peggy. But she's there with Francine. And Francine even kind of says something because Betty says like, oh, Don was late, and Francine is like, Carlton's always late. Kind of a little bit of a subtle thing. It's like, oh, is Carlton probably because he's cheating? I mean, we already kind of saw in Marriage of Figaro that Carlton has a little bit of a, the thing with like Helen Bishop, and Helen Bishop gets mentioned here too.
And Don caught them, right?
Don what?
Didn't Don catch him cheating in the birthday party?
He didn't catch him cheating. He caught him and Helen Bishop like having a conversation, but it's not implied that Don saw anything improper going on.
Who do you see making out?
He saw just the regular normal neighbors who had a functional marriage, and that was probably that was probably more sickening to Don than if he had seen Helen Bishop and Carlton making out. He probably saw the two people who are actually married to each other and like each other. He's probably like, disgusting. The heck is this?
In my house.
Exactly. Betty kind of starts talking about how she's like, I should get the royal treatment when I get into Don's office. Like she should be some kind of trophy or something. I always find this moment kind of weird too. It's like, well, it's a creative director. Like, chill out, Betty. Like the royal treatment. Like,
yeah, okay. I thought that was a little much. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Like, calm down, Your Highness.
Get it? It's like, okay.
Yeah. Also, I think the photo. Well, we only see a couple photos, but the first one's pretty bad that we see. But the second one, they're not great. But that's the one we see is
Don's
okay.
Looking at the camera like he just saw somebody walk into a diner who isn't a white Protestant. Like, come on.
But I mean, like, is it much worse than most family photos? Like,
yeah, I would say so.
I don't know. I feel like I see most family photos I see aren't that great. Sorry.
If you say so. I won't say I'm an expert. But yeah, they kind of remark that like they can't really connect. Like when they go into like their husband's offices, there's clearly like a disconnect. Like they don't feel like they belong. And they both kind of agree that outside of Manhattan, they think their husbands are better. So then we go to the Liberty Capital Savings meeting with the clients, and it works out pretty well. And something that's kind of interesting about this is Don clearly still has Adam on his mind. There's a moment, so he's kind of like preoccupied with that. He's a little distant in this meeting. Pete Campbell is still kind of like reeling from the situation where he basically was, chastised for, the Bethlehem Steel thing. He's definitely like kissing up to Don, being like, Don had this Roman candle of an idea. Okay, Pete. But what's interesting here is that Don turns it over to Paul to give the pitch. Paul gets a little bit of like a minor win here. He gets to sell the pitch to the client, and it goes really well. In fact, the client even suggests that it could be executive private account, which is a combination of Don and Paul's idea, because earlier Paul had suggested private account and Don was like executive account. Client kind of just went with both, not even knowing that Paul had come up with that. And it's all speaking, of course, the idea of like taking credit for something. And Pete gets this win. He gets this moment, but he still lashes out at Ken Cosgrove. He still kind of sees what's going on with Ken, and he just can't stomach it. He can't stand it. And so he rips out, the paper in the Atlantic with Ken, and pretty brutal. He's, trying to like show him up. But then later, Ken, of course, he goes up to Ken and is like, hey, I'm sorry. I didn't, I knew I was like competing with all these other guys. I didn't know I was competing with you. And then Ken destroys him, just like obliterates him with 2 words: you lost.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty good stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah. So then Don goes back to his office. He's sorting through his mail. He notices that he has an envelope addressed to Don Draper. And then he finds a photograph of himself when he was 20 years old in his uniform, sitting next to Adam, who at the time was, I guess, 9. Which I guess it was like a little bit of a flub, right? Because I thought it was supposed to say that Adam was 8 when he died, but maybe I'm misremembering. So then he sees, though, that the hotel stationery shows Adam's address and his room number, which gives Don an idea. But first we go back to Pete. Pete is home, where he tells Trudy the good news. Or no, Trudy tells him the good news that Charlie offered to publish a story, but in Boy's Life magazine. Pete is super bitter and angry about this because he's like, it could have been the New Yorker. And he basically suggests that, she should have prostituted herself to get him into the New Yorker. She even says like, I could have done it. And like the implication is obvious.
Is it New Yorker or is it it's like, there was another publication, I think she said.
She mentions a couple, but the New Yorker, I think, is the one that he mentions.
Right. No, that is the one he mentions. Yeah. For one, Boy's Life, such a good line, such a good joke. Pete is always
he wants to be a man and
wants to be a man. He's always going to be a child in a way,
or
at least in this first season. Him getting denigrated to, being, well, not only in Boy's Life, but I think they had to pay to be in Boy's Life.
$40 fee.
Yeah,
so around $400. It's pretty like in today's standard.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, that was a great line. But yeah, like I said, as we alluded to earlier, this is kind of Pete's low point for this episode, basically saying that like he's judging his wife for not sleeping with a former flame to get her husband's literary work published in a fine establishment like the New Yorker. So
right.
He's not a good guy in this episode.
Yeah, she has every right to look at the situation and be like, she doesn't understand why he would put her in that position, she says. And like you can kind of see the sort of like the facade of their marriage like breaking down. She's starting to see him for who he really is, which arguably, why did it take you so long? But okay, so we go to
the honeymoon phase,
Yes. we go back to the Draper residence, and Don and Betty are discussing some of their summer vacationing plans, but he's very distracted about the whole thing. He goes to his study where he burns the photograph that Adam gave him, and then he uses the number to call Adam and arranges to go see him. He opens up a briefcase, and then he puts something in it, but we don't see what it is. He goes over to Adam's apartment or hotel room, whichever it is. It's kind of this dilapidated place, as you can imagine. It's a very tense scene. And there's 5G. A moment where he's just like, Uncle Mac thought you were soft. And, but you're not soft or whatever it is. And then Don's like, no, I'm not. And they're setting it up actually in kind of, I think Weiner is playing with the expectation of like in a lesser show, Don would have shot Adam. He would have killed him, right? No loose ends and everything. Because most TV shows, that's what we would be getting at, right? It's the cheap thrills of TV. I think Emily Vanderwerf or Emily St. James has mentioned that when she was writing her essays on Mad Men, of like, that's one of the things that separated that first season from other shows at the time in 2007. It wasn't trying to be Lost. It wasn't trying to be, just this kind of like short term, like cheap thrill kind of TV show. It was playing at something deeper. And I think that deep meaning, or what she's saying that the show gets at, is the idea that like, it's honest. It's more about like, what would somebody realistically do in this situation? And what it ends up being is Don tries to buy Adam off, gives him $5,000, which basically would be like what his salary for an entire year, close to it.
Well, I did the math.
Yeah.
Because this is 1962, right?
1960.
1960. Well, in any case, I mean, maybe it might be off slightly, but it should be $48,000, $393, or yeah, $48,393.38.
Yeah, it's pretty absurd. It's a lot of money. It's a savings.
2022 standards. Yeah.
It's certainly a ploy. He wants Adam to leave and to reinvent himself, to never see him again, and to do what Don did. They hug. Adam is super upset. Don leaves. He goes back home, and then he tells Betty, that it's okay. They can go to the Cape or whatever. And you see Don rejecting his real family, and at least for the time being, showing that he's open to receiving Betty's family, the family that he married into as Don Draper. And this episode ends where it began, with him and Betty going to sleep in their bedroom. And it's one of the most like TV episodes of this show, in the sense that it's very standalone. It ends almost exactly where it begins in a lot of ways. And you could watch this as like a prototypical pilot in some respects if you really wanted to. But I do want to say, before we kind of wrap things up here, I love the 3 scenes with Don and Adam. They play out like if you just took them out of this episode, if you took them out of this entire series, and you just had a short story of a play where you had 2 people have the conversations that they have. You start with like Don going into the waiting room and talking to Adam, and then you have them in the diner, and then you finish it in this room. Brilliant. I think it would be brilliant. In fact, I'd love to see somebody try to like pull that off, because you don't need anything else in this episode. You don't need anything else in the show. It all speaks for itself. And it's like, to me, the best example of how great this writing is, that it can just exist like that and still be so good.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, it would be kind of intriguing on its own, because you're fed all this information, but you had to kind of, it has to unravel for you a little bit, but it's all detailed out in their conversation, but not in like an exposition heavy way. Like it's all pretty,
and it
honest.
speaks to how, if Don was honest about his past, if he's honest about the situation, he could write a heck of a short story. He could write an amazing novel, but he's never going to do that. How could he? That's just not like what he has decided he wants to do for himself.
Yeah. So, one less writer at the publishing house, maybe not so bad, but it gives Don, less closure, I guess, in his personal life. So that's a fault, I guess. But I don't know. So
overall, did you like this episode, Will? What do you think?
It's a good episode. I don't know if it's like the best episode we've done so far, but it's certainly a good one.
Yeah, it's not the best. I think it has aspects of some of the best of the season. It has like really good stuff in it, but yeah, it doesn't come together as well as some of the other ones. It's no Marriage of Figaro.
Sure. I think it's, like we said before, I think the themes of it are very present. I think they are satisfactory. I think it comes together in a good way. I like you said, how standalone it is. But it does. When I think about it, as this conversation is probably detailed, I think a lot about like how the themes of it resonate, rather than like how does the characters really stand out, with the exception of the Don/Dick Adam stuff. So
yeah, I like how the episode title, it doesn't just refer to Adam's room number. It doesn't just refer to how much money that Don gives him, but also it's the 5th episode. It's kind of nice whenever they play around with that, find those like fun coincidences that they can just kind of do.
Sure. 5G, more like 5K.
The same thing. 5Gs, Will. Like you don't even have to.
Yeah, no.
You want to run?
I think,
at least Don didn't run a 5K in this episode. That'd have been a little much.
Yeah. 5Gs.
I I also just love what this episode begins to say about the American dream as it relates to the 1960s, because Don is like, if you really look at it superficially, he's a self-made man. I know we've talked about this already. And this episode is where we get to really more clearly see the downsides of how the American dream has worked out for him, because he started from nothing, and there's something respectable about how he kind of built all of this stuff on his own without, inheriting anything. This episode talks about that with Pete, being somebody who didn't have to work as hard to get as successful as he was. But this does show the downside being that he has to leave others behind. He has to reject his family. There's even like an adage that a lot of people, like very capitalist people, like to say. It's like, we got to learn from the past, but you have to look forward to succeed. This notion that you can't succeed by embracing the past. And I kind of like how Matthew Weiner is poking at that a bit and showing that it's not so cut and dry, which is very interesting for a show that was, again, airing like at the end of like the fall of 2007. I guess in this case it was late summer.
And also a show that's like so indebted to the past just by design too, That's
so what?
That's like so like indebted to the past, like so about
right.
The 60s, about our relationship to the past as far as just like nostalgia, our perception of it versus reality and all that jazz.
No, that's a really great point, because Weiner clearly understands that for us to actually learn from the past, you have to embrace with the honest truths about what life was like in the 1960s, the fact that there was a lot of sexism, that there was a lot of racism, and that the 50s and 60s often get whitewashed and sugar-coated for, this sort of like mythos, American mythos that came to a lot of prominence in certain sections of the country in the years that follow, like through the baby boomer generation. So yeah, I love that Matthew Weiner has a point of view with this show, and he always digs at it, and he finds like tons of new ways to say similar things, but in enlightening ways. I think that's what makes him a really great showrunner and a really great writer and director, in my opinion. And this is another good showcase of that. Not the best episode of the season, but definitely an important one in the sense that it certainly lays the groundwork for a lot of what we're going to see later in the show. Any last thoughts on this, though? The only other thing I'll say is not my favorite Pete story. Although I love that scene with him and Trudy and the bear. But other than that, it's not I felt like it's a little bit of trodden ground. Like, I think we got it at this point with Pete. It doesn't really add that much new or insight to the guy, but it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, more of with the exception of Dawn, I guess more of a standout episode for Ken Cosgrove. Yep. But yeah, otherwise, I mean,
accounts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I think what you were saying before is why it is fun to talk about this show in podcast form. Like it has such, big, grand, lofty thoughts to say about it, but each episode works really well as a, standalone installment, something you kind of ruminate on and kind of think about, and how each episode tackles a lot of similar themes, but in different and often resonant ways. It's a good show, I'd say. Yeah. Maybe you would say the same thing.
I would say keep in mind too, if you're watching this show for the first time, a lot of people, this question gets brought up a lot. Who is Don Draper? And this is an episode that kind of answers the question, but not really. And I think the point is less of answering the question and more so pointing out that if Don answered that question, or if he was willing to answer that question and live it out, he would probably find what he seems to be searching for. Now, whether or not that's true is up to the viewer. And so I look forward to watching more of the show with you, Will, and seeing where you land on all that.
Sure. One final thing I'll discuss with you, and you can indulge this conversation as much or as little as possible, but something I've been thinking about.
Okay.
So I've been seeing more recently, and I don't know if this is the case for you because we have different timelines as we have discussed on Cinemaholics, but I've seen people really kind of questioning on Twitter and different social media feeds, like, why is it that Jon Hamm hasn't really found a lot of success outside of Mad Men, as far as like his cinematic
like
career?
An equal amount of success, you mean? Because he's found success, like good roles, and
like
he's still working.
Well, he's been in like good movies, but he's never really like the stand-up part of those films. Maybe the only real exception would be something like The Town or Bridesmaids. But like it's usually only really in like the comedy stuff, like I said, like Bridesmaids or like 30 Rock, or I didn't watch it.
He has a small role in Top Gun Maverick, yeah.
Sure. But like it never really feels like he's like exceptional or even really particularly great outside of playing Don Draper on Mad Men.
I would say he's great in Baby Driver, one of my favorite roles from him, and I would also say he's pretty great in Bad Times at the El Royale. So it has happened.
I think he's fine in both. I don't think he really stands out much in either, to be honest.
But okay.
But I don't know. I mean, I just feel like there's something kind of interesting about the idea of like Jon Hamm is another, a guy who he wanted to go into this business more as a comedy actor, as like an improv actor. And he found himself in the
arguably. I mean, he was in a lot of different kinds of shows, not really like straight up comedy. When he started out in things like Ally McBeal, right? Like very like one episode there, and
he gravitated more towards comedy than drama. Like it was a departure for him to play Don Draper, from what I could tell.
I mean, I think it was less like comedy and more sort of like, network dramas, but not like the kind of drama that Mad Men is. Because he was in like Gilmore Girls and The Division. Yeah. He was in a lot of The Division.
But it seems like he excels more, like we said, like when he gets to be a little bit looser, when like people allow him to not really be a Don Draper type, but to like kind of play against his good looks. Certainly like Bridesmaid, like I said, like he is like a good looking, handsome guy, but he's such like an ignorant doofus who's like, good at sex, but just can't really read the room or anything like that, which is like almost the opposite of Don Draper, like someone who just can't really read and perceive people's emotions, stuff like that, which I think it's just weird to me that like he, it's like someone like Bryan Cranston outside of Breaking Bad has like never really found another role, with the exception, I guess, of Lyndon B. Johnson on Broadway, like that has equaled Walter White, but he's like kind of found like a way to balance between comedy and drama and like, excel enough to like, prove his talents in different films and TV shows. I'm trying to think of like some other actors from prestige dramas. I mean, certainly like James Gandolfini, unfortunately, who passed away. But like before that, he was doing a lot of really interesting things as an actor, playing more like tender, like emotional roles, like stuff that kind of played against his image as Tony Soprano. Certainly, I think his role as Carol in Where the Wild Things Are is maybe his best performance outside of Tony Soprano. I don't know, I just think it's interesting that for as incredible as Jon Hamm has been on this show, that he's never really found a way to play or subvert that much and really like excel in a way that like someone like Elisabeth Moss, who's like just been on, such a rise past the show's run. It just, he hasn't had that same success. And I feel like it might just be because he hasn't really found or allowed himself to find the roles that really play to his strengths as an actor.
I mean, I get what you're saying. I think it's not that I disagree. It's just that I don't think he's really tried that many times. He's too old to kind of have that, like, he's not a Will Smith right off of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And I think the Don Draper performance is so iconic that the roles that he ends up getting that are probably the most intriguing to him are ones that sort of play off of his sort of Don Draper persona, his old-fashioned looks, like you were saying. And I don't think that he is that kind of actor who has found himself, getting into a new kind of niche, and I think that, like you said, it's happened with Bryan Cranston, like he had a couple of big roles right off of Breaking Bad, like Godzilla and everything. But I mean, over time, he eventually just started getting kind of like main roles in smaller movies and nothing huge in terms of like awards. Like Trumbo was like one of the last few, right?
You say that, but he's starring in Jerry and Marge Go Large, which is going to probably win him a couple Oscars, maybe even an Emmy. I don't know.
I think that Jon Hamm could have like a really big role for him coming up, either in movies or TV. I would suspect TV is more likely. And I know, isn't he going to be the main guy in Fargo the next season?
Yeah, which I don't know. I mean, it's interesting, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if that's an upgrade or a denigration for him, but at this point, but yeah, I mean, it's not like he's like hurting for work or anything. Like you said, he's in Top Gun Maverick, which is the biggest movie in the world right now. So
yeah, he's an actor in his 50s who still looks like he's in his 40s. And I think he's just at an interesting point in his career. And I think that like a new era of roles for him is probably just around the corner. And he has great connections. By all accounts, he's a really great actor to work with. So I think that like good stuff is ahead of him. I don't know if there'll be anything as good as Mad Men, but I don't even think he cares at this point. He's probably just having fun with the roles that he's taking.
Well, looks like he was in a film that either just premiered or will premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival called Quarter Office, which stars
that's right,
Danny Pudi.
That's the Joaquin Back movie.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, just the poster alone for this looks kind of fun. It looks like he's kind of playing against his Don Draper persona. Has kind of a more like Weasley look to him. So I don't know. Maybe he will finally get that role that like allows him to kind of diversify away from the Don Draper persona that he's been. A role that's kind of like shadowed and in maybe some cases prevented him from really excelling past his time on the show. But I don't know. It is something I found kind of interesting to think about.
Well, we'll have to re-examine that as we move forward with this show. But with that, until the next episode of Mad Men Men, we've been a couple of mad men.
Couple, but not a few.